Hello and welcome back to Encounters with God, stories from the Old Testament. And I'm your host again, I'm Dan Green. And in the guest chair, it's Bern Leckie again, our usual host. But I wanted to have another conversation with Bern to hear how he's getting on with the idea of box set binging the Bible, which we talked about in the last episode. Bern shared his passion for why listening to the Bible at pace can really have an impact. And I wanted to know how he's getting on with that. So, Bern, tell us how it's been going and what you've been listening to.
I've been enjoying a really brisk listen through the book of Genesis, which is like kind of origin stories, I think, for everything. I've started thinking about it like it was the original Marvel Cinematic Universe episode. Right. And when they introduce in the Marvel films, which are brilliant and easy to box set binge through, you get introduced to not only to the characters but to these big ideas, the big things that the characters are facing that are kind of recognizable. The struggle between good and evil. You get introduced to how they're dealing with power and how it's used and how to control it and how to get over your own issues with it and things like that. So those are great origin stories. Well, Genesis is an amazing collection of origin stories about humanity, about emotions, about how we separate right and wrong, how we deal with the people kind of whose interests just kind of bang against each other and we can't work out like how to settle differences. All of that massive stuff that's very, very relatable today. There's a story for just about all of it in Genesis.
Okay, so you decided to start at the beginning, which I guess makes sense. And you are listening at pace rather than kind of studying in depth. We talked about that approach a bit last week. So how long has it taken you, and what does it actually look like in terms of when you've been doing this?
Oh, good question. So I planned on it taking about a week. I think if it takes you a week to get through Genesis, you'll probably get through the whole Old Testament in about three to 3.5 months. I actually did it in about 4 days. I wasn't trying to be swotty, because it's not about that. I was just getting engrossed in it and also enjoying playing video games at the same time. So I was able to scoop out large chunks of late night with playing Fall Guys and a golf game. And at the same time, I think I got through about half of Genesis almost in one session. It was amazing. Okay,
and your brain was able to do that and not be completely vacant to the stories of Genesis while you were on the 18th tee.
I think so. I mean, you can ask me about it. Give me. We're not studying for a test, but no, you feel free to ask me what I remember from it. Honestly, I think it can be really helpful to do two things at the same time. For one thing, I mean, sometimes some days it was washing up, or just cleaning, or bits and bobs around the house. I think there's one of the benefits of doing that is that it occupies part of our minds, the part that wants to be busy and getting on with things, the part that actually, when we sit down and try and force ourselves to read large chunks of text, distracts us from the text. Right? We might actually try and force ourselves to study. And then none of it really goes in. Or the other thing that happens when we study is that we get bogged down in a bit and then go and find a rabbit hole to go off and occupy us for the whole evening. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't help us move through at pace. It doesn't help us see the big picture. So I just tend to find that while I'm doing something else and listening to the Bible, a couple of things happen. One is things stand out unexpectedly, and that's a thing to watch out for at the time, but also a few days later. So things will sort of pour into your head they'll make connections somewhere in your brain that you don't see and we're never aware of. But a few days later, the things that are interesting have made connections that have kind of then sort of hold your interest and grab your attention again a few days later. And I think just that process is really good to go through, because it kind of reveals things in us of where we need to engage and where it's been valuable to engage with the Bible, which we wouldn't have necessarily found in a slow study. The other thing is doing things means that we're also engaging parts of our brains which just connect with life generally. So if I'm tidying up the living room or doing the washing up or something, I'm listening to the Bible, but I'm also thinking about people. I'm thinking about my family. I'm thinking about my neighbours and things that we're going to do. And while I'm thinking about kind of both of those at the same time, connections seem to get made. I'm not going to pretend I'm the neuroscience expert on that, but I think it is different. So if you only hear the Bible when you're sitting in a pew and you're in church mode, you know, that's different, I think, from when you're hearing it while you're washing up and you're in family mode.
Yes.
So I'd like both.
So that strikes me as quite similar, Bern, to what you were saying in the last episode, where you were talking about moving from the idea of having one quiet time at the start of the day to having lots of quiet times through the day, and just kind of integrating our spirituality and our walk with God into daily life. And in the same way, even listening to the Bible as you go about cleaning the house, it's about connecting what we're thinking about and what we're reading about or listening to with daily life and with relationships that we're in. I love that thought. That's a really, really helpful one. So tell us what some of the things are that struck you as you listened through Genesis in 4 days. What are some of the things, what are some of the connections that got made, or some of the things that stuck?
So I think I can never get over the awesomeness of the beginning of Genesis. Like the scope of it, the ambition of it, the scale of, here's our place in the universe. Here's our place on the whole of the earth. That it's bigger than us. It was here before us. God has always been involved and always loved it. All these times when he looks and says, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good. You know, we were born into this thing. And I know, obviously, you know, we're going to get into trouble if we treat the Bible as a science textbook. Don't worry, I was trained as a scientist, and I've as well as reading the Bible, we've got a subscription to New Scientist, which knocks around the house, and we love, finding out what people are finding going on in the world physically. All good, but the idea of, was the world literally made in 7 days? I don't think we have to fuss about that too much. I think the thing that strikes me as ongoing relevant, and the reason why they needed the story wasn't because anyone was asking how long it took to make the world. They were asking, who are we? Where did we come from? Where do we fit in? What does our life mean? Those are questions which are still absolutely vital and relevant. And I'm just. I think I've just been struck the last few weeks with things that have been in the news, that sometimes just how often we mess things up because of our utter short-sightedness and selfishness. So we can't look past our own immediate concerns and immediate interests. And that means, it's difficult to make the changes we need to protect the world from climate change or from disease. It's difficult to acknowledge that not everything should be done in our own immediate short-term comfort interests, and yet if we only see ourselves from the perspective of how much came before us and how much is still there effectively when we die, it's almost impossible to look at life the same way. And sometimes some people have experienced this when they've gone up, and a very small number of people have seen the planet from a distance and had what they've called spiritual experiences, which I would love to have one day. That sounds amazing. But I think you can also have that if you open up Genesis, or open up your ears to Genesis, and just let it come in as a perspective on who we are, which is just very different from what we might think about every day otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. I love that comparison with the view from outer space, which few have. But what else, Ben? As you've then trawled through other stories at pace and gone through, I guess, Noah and Abraham and Cain and Abel, and I mean, there are all these very human stories in there, aren't there? What else kind of stuck?
I think I was struck this time a lot by the story of Babel and the Tower of Babel, which is a really interesting kind of origin story of how come cultures don't get on with each other. Like, how come we have all these different languages? Where do our misunderstandings in general come from? And there's this weird idea that maybe there was a time when, or a possibility for humans to work together and do something amazing, like technically amazing, that would have even reached up to heaven or challenged the gods somehow. And it's put in those weird terms. It is about gods rather than God when you look at it carefully, because God starts to sort of talk about himself as us rather than me, and so yeah. My take on that is that this is a clue that we're reading some mythology. We're reading a story that is not necessarily things that we have to believe literally happened, but would have made sense to everyone listening at the time as fitting into a range of stories that all cultures had of just explaining our origins and explaining how things have come to be. And what I find fascinating, if you look at it from one angle, it looks like God deliberately messed us all up, which is very uncomfortable. If you take it really literally, it looks like the Bible that God just sort of came down to human culture and gave us all different languages so that we wouldn't be able to communicate with each other properly, and then we wouldn't be a threat to him. Well, that's a story. That's an interesting story, but it doesn't really gel in that sense with any of the rest of the Bible. Certainly not with anything that Jesus brings along later. I think it makes more sense to me to look at this as a story that was passed around to explain difference in general, and also kind of working backwards. You think, well, what if we did get to that point where we could work together? What if we did get to the point where we could get over our cultural differences? How much could we achieve? That's the looking at the story backwards. It's like, actually, humanity is capable of an incredible amount if we work together. And I find that then quite an encouragement rather than a discouragement. And I don't believe God really wants to stop us from doing that. I think everything that I'm finding, that I'm learning, walk with Jesus, is about, well, that's where he wants us to be going. That's what he's reconnecting us as a body to do. That seemed to me a good reminder of how to regard each other, even though we have differences. Yeah.
There's a book on my bookshelf with a picture of the Tower of Babel on it. And it's a book by the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And the title is The Dignity of Difference. And he's obviously Jewish, and he explores that story, but also explores how we live in Britain today with all the different cultures, ethnicities, faiths that make up our society. And this idea of how do we live well with difference is a really fascinating one. So you touched on something, Bern, when you just said briefly there that for you there are some clues in that story that perhaps we're looking at myth rather than historical or archaeological fact. That, what for you are some tips or ways that you think about that as you look at the different stories, and you think about what kind of genre is being written or what the point of the story was? Is this a metaphor that teaches us an important lesson, or is it something that actually happened in human history? What are some of the ways that you go about thinking about that? and deciding which stories are which?
First of all, let me just kind of come down from the expectation, if anyone had any, of me being any kind of expert or having made a decision even about which bits are more mythology than literal truth. Partly because I think the way the Bible's written, it sort of blurs the lines on that, and there's no real difficulty with that for its original audience. We have difficulty with that today because we tend to look at everything that's written down in a different way, particularly if something's appearing to be history. We want to know, well, what's your evidence for this? Where's your archaeological proof of blah blah blah? Or if something's written down as teaching, we want to know the logic behind it. And we'll look at things in much more in the way that the Greeks looked at literature and ideas more than the Hebrews did. So it's very difficult to kind of interpret what's basically a Hebrew text with a different mindset. I would say as well, I recognise what a sensitive thing it is as well when people are sort of processing faith, and faith is a massive thing, massively important thing. And for some people, I know it is we might have different views on whether or not the beginning of Genesis is literally true. And I don't want to be disrespectful of people who passionately believe, and it's important to them to read it a different way from the way I do. What I would say, though, having said that, is in how I've processed it, I've tried to look at it through how do I think someone who heard this at the time would have heard it. Would it have been important to them that this was literally true or not? And would there have been clues for them that say, nah, this is like a, just treat this like a metaphor, like a myth. One of those, I think, may be the ages of people. So when you hear about people who were 1,000 years old, is it critical for us to believe that people lived incredibly long lifespans? I don't know. I can imagine it might have happened. I imagine lots of things might have happened. I'm just wondering that if the longer the lifespan of people you're hearing about, the more of a big sign this is that you're listening to something which is a story where the truth is in its meaning rather than in its literal historicity, if you like. The other thing I think, so one big clue, I think, for anyone who is like a farmer at the time, there were a lot of people worked the land in the culture, would have heard the story of Noah and his ark, which I love, but there's so many plot holes, and the idea that all of the animals would have fitted onto a boat, I think might have been a very clear sign to people at the time that this wasn't literally true, that he was telling a story, that a story was being told about maybe an important historical event. There definitely seemed to be some sort of flood, some sort of big thing that went wrong in the environment that lots of cultures talked about, but wasn't necessarily a worldwide thing, wasn't necessarily the only way that humanity survived. It wasn't necessarily that only Noah and his family then kind of interbred with themselves to make lots of other races. I don't think anyone would have necessarily taken that too literally at the time, and so I don't think we need to necessarily fuss about that either. So again, the truth is in the meaning, and looking at and then I'm very interested in, well, what can we learn from this in the way that we see relationships unfolding and the way we treat each other, rather than having to worry too much about whether we find archaeological evidence of a boat somewhere. And before I'm completely condemned by this for anyone who's listening, getting a bit sore about it, let me just humbly walk with me in the direction of Jesus, because Jesus told so many stories. Jesus told so many really good stories that everyone knew he made up. The prodigal son, no one's worried about whether or not there's archaeological evidence to find the actual house of the actual prodigal son. We know that Jesus was telling truth through a story. It's perfectly biblical. It's very respectful and of God and what he's trying to do with us, to look for the truth and the meaning of that story without worrying about, was there really a prodigal son? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, Bern. You've done incredibly well with a very difficult question that I'm just glad you didn't ask me. Genuinely, there's lots of helpful thoughts for us to process in there. And I think that overall impression of really the meaning of story and the power of story, and that the truth in itself, the truth could be more about the point and the meaning rather than the kind of historical validity. So yeah, thank you for all that you've shared there. And as I think we said in the first episode of this series, we hope that Seven is an environment, a community where people can have these conversations openly. And yeah, maybe together we can kind of make progress in our thoughts on these things.
Brilliant. That sounds amazing. Let's do that.
Thank you, Bern, for all that you've shared today. And thank you to all of you who are listening. Join us again for another episode of this series in the coming weeks.